Welcome to the Chronological Christie podcast, in which a long-time Agatha Christie collector and her Christie novice husband discuss the works of the Queen of Crime in publication order. In this episode, we take a look at the second half of the Mysterious Mr. Quin short story collection.
Welcome to the Chronological Christie podcast. We are your hosts.
Gillian Porter, a long-time Agatha Christie reader and collector.
And her husband, Alan Porter, who after almost 40 years of sharing a house with Agatha Christie books, has decided he should read them.
We'll be tackling the books in UK publication order as detailed on the official Agatha Christie website and sharing our thoughts on each from the viewpoint of someone familiar with them
and someone reading them for the first time. At this point in the podcast, we would normally talk about what was going on in the world and with Agatha the year of publication. However, as this is the second book published in the UK in 1930, we already covered those in the episode on the murder at the vicarage. This is our regular spoiler warning that during our discussions, we will be diving into plot and character details as well as talking about who done it and why. And with that said, let's dive into the short stories from the Mysterious Mr. Quin short story collection. There are no TV adaptations this time around. As we will be covering multiple stories, we've changed the format a little and we'll be tackling each story as follows: title, synopsis, and then the story discussion. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jill.
Thank you. The Mysterious Mr. Quin is a short story collection by British writer Agatha Christie, first published in the UK and the US in 1930. Each chapter or story involves a separate mystery that is solved through the interaction between the characters of Mr. Satterthwaite, an elderly socialite, and the eponymous Mr. Quin, who appears almost magically at the most opportune moments and disappears just as mysteriously. In her foreword to the collection, Christie states, "Mr. Quin, I consider, is an epicure's taste." Her husband, Max Mallowan, described the stories as detection written in a fanciful vein, touching on the fairy story, a natural product of Agatha's peculiar imagination. Christie's favourite stories were The World's End, The Man from the Sea, and Harlequin's Lane. The first one we're going to cover is The Voice in the Dark. Mr. Satterthwaite investigates his friend's daughter, who appears to be hearing voices. Is it her imagination, or is the sinister demand for something stolen a warning? Mr. Quin glides into the picture, dropping clues and setting Satterthwaite's thoughts along the right path, as always leading him towards a resolution. In this story, they again stay at the Bells and Motley, mentioned in an earlier story of the same name. This story has never been adapted. What were your opinions on this one, Alan?
Well, it's always good to get back to a pub, I guess, isn't it?
Well, I'm looking forward to that when we go back to the UK. So you agree, yes.
This is one of the longest stories in the collection, and even has its own mini chapter breaks. I think it's the first one that does that in this collection. But in some ways, it felt like one of the most insubstantial ones so far. The two sisters in a shipwreck and only one survived backstory that Mr. Satterthwaite describes really is pretty much a big hint of what's happening here. And surprise, surprise, the faithful servant just happens to turn out to be the long-lost sister who is slowly regaining her memory and wants her inheritance back.
Shocker.
I know. That's what you call a spoiler, folks. Given the popularity of seances, etc., amongst the British upper class at the time, I thought it was interesting to see Christie here treating it sort of as a fraudulent distraction. She did not really take it very seriously. But the dialogue spoken by the so-called Native American spirit guide that's conjured up was really cringeworthy, I think unworthy of Agatha Christie. I know it was how Native Americans were in general depicted at the time with that speech pattern, but it just didn't sit well. There's very little of Mr. Quin here, which was sort of disappointing. I don't really feel he contributed much to Satterthwaite's resolution of the case either, despite the official synopsis says. I thought Quin's insistence that he meet him at the Bells and Motley pub rather than agree to go on site of the mystery was interesting. Made me think, is he tied to the pub in some way? Or do they just serve a good pint and he likes a good night out there? I don't know. But there was some fun continuity here as well with both the pub and the mention of the encounter in Corsica too. So I sort of like that light continuity that she's building throughout these stories. What about you, Jill? What did you think of this one?
I agree with all your points, but at the same time, I found this one more propulsive than you did. And definitely for some of the others, as there is a definite threat to the young girl Marjorie, who had nothing to do with her mother stealing her aunt's inheritance. So you feel a bit sorry for the poor girl because she has absolutely no idea what's going on. And what she has been threatened with has nothing to do with her, really. But it was very easy to dislike the mother, though. And I did enjoy Satterthwaite's frustration at how easily she palmed that errand off on him. I thought that was quite cleverly written, and it summed up the mother beautifully, I thought. The seance was definitely cringeworthy, but it also did move the story along, as did the mother's death. And that was interesting because when she died, you're kind of like, oh, all right. It's usually, you should feel sad, even in a book, if somebody dies, because it's not the right thing. But she wasn't a particularly nice person, so I don't know if that affected or because she was in it very little, it was just like oh, all right, because I didn't think too much of it, if that makes sense.
Yes, it didn't really have much emotional impact at all because you said she was hardly in it, and when she wasn't particularly pleasant. It was needed to move the story along, as you say, but it didn't really carry any weight to it.
Yeah. Like I was disappointed in Mr. Quin's 2 rather brief appearances, especially as he seemed pretty determined not to be helpful this time. The solving of it all was definitely down to Mr. Satterthwaite's knowledge and interest in the upper classes. That's what solved the mystery and kept Marjorie safe. We didn't really get to know any of the characters very well at all, but kind of well enough at the same time so that it pulled the story along. I would say not one of her best, but not one of the worst. Now we'll move on to The Face of Helen. After a visit to the opera, Mr. Quin and Mr. Satterthwaite witness a fight outside the opera house. But what could have prompted such behaviour? Mr. Quin's appearance in the opera interval suggests that forces of love and jealousy must be at work and someone is in danger. The story was abridged for BBC Radio 4 and performed by Martin Jarvis in 2010. Okay, Alan, let's have your opinion on this one.
Considering the opera connection and how it applies to Mr. Quin and the character of Harley Quinn generally, I was surprised that this story was probably his shortest appearance yet. They do seem to be getting shorter and shorter as we go through these stories. I like the idea that Mr. Satterthwaite figured out the clues to stop a tragedy before it happened. That was an interesting twist. This was less of a whodunit and more how will he do it. Having said that, I felt the setup of the method that the jilted suitor and mentor Mr. Eastney intended to use to poison the beautiful Gillian West remotely, while also using Mr. Satterthwaite as his alibi. I felt it was so blatantly telegraphed that certain sentences could have been written in bold with a footnote that said clue, and it wouldn't have been any less subtle. Partway through, as I was reading it, I think I turned to you and I'm like, I know what's going to happen. I think it was a nice idea. The idea of having this mechanism in place to poison somebody remotely while you're at the time that you're out having dinner with the guy who's potentially going to investigate it, I thought was a nice idea. But I don't think it quite worked in the execution of it. And again, for a book that has his name on it, not enough Mr. Quin in this one for me. What about you, Jill?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you said. And as I really don't know anything about opera, some of the significance and reference to the Harlequinade missed me totally. Not sure if that would have added much to the actual story, though, as I don't really feel I missed anything. As you said, Alan, it wasn't very subtle. It was very interesting, though, as I felt that what Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quin discussed seemed more about a certain type of man being obsessed with a face, rather than getting to know the person behind it. And you could feel the pity for the poor girl in that situation from both of them as they discussed it, because you feel if you're falling in love with a face, you have no idea what's behind it. And that's just terrible for the poor girl. Like you said, the clues were rather heavily laid on. But at one point, I was confused, as I thought they were taking tea in a cafe and wondered why she would take a radio to show Mr. Satterthwaite, because I was just like, radios weren't very small back then either. It's not like she could just pop it in her pocket or her handbag, and then I was like, suddenly, oh, yeah, they're having tea at her place. And then I was like, how appropriate is that? They'd met once and she's happily invited this old guy back to her place, who obviously doesn't appear to be a threat. But again, kind of weird to be doing that. My inference from that is she doesn't obviously have very many people that she can confide in, which is also very sad. Satterthwaite has much more of an active participation role in this rather than just observing, and I'm not sure if I liked the change. Not enough Mr. Quin, as you said, Alan. Again, I guess they can't all be winners, but these two that we've just talked about, are just not doing it for me. They're written well, but the substance just isn't there for me. So I'm hoping we'll get some better ones as we move along.
The Dead Harlequin. Mr. Satterthwaite comes across a painting which stirs memory of a past death, as Mr. Quin observes the events from both the picture and the present. As can be seen throughout these stories, Mr. Satterthwaite, like Agatha Christie, is a great patron of the arts, and he has a valuable art collection, but no heirs to leave it to. The story was abridged for BBC Radio 4 and performed by Martin Jarvis in 2011. What about you, Jill? What did you think of this one with the mysterious painting?
I don't think this was a winner for me either, unfortunately. I felt like this one covered a lot of mental gymnastics and way too many coincidences for me. My main issue with the whole thing is, how did Mr. Satterthwaite see the house a year ago if it had been locked up, like 15 years, I think it was, that it had been locked up? There is no way he would have travelled in a charabanc like the artist, but then that infers that the house is open to the public. So how can it be locked up and open to the public at the same time? Maybe I think too much about these things and the stories, but that part to me was very confusing. I did very much enjoy the explanation of the art in the gallery. It was written well. It evoked a certain type of style. I thought that was very well written and it was interesting. Probably for me, the best part of the story. The denouement, if you like, while interesting, wasn't much of a surprise. With Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quin involved, it was never going to be suicide. Maybe I've read enough of these mysteries, but instead of feeling sorry for Lady Charnley, I was cross at her for being such a ninny and becoming a shadow instead of getting on with her life and being there for her son. 15 years she's had of just being this shadowy person that everybody's talked about because her husband seemingly committed suicide. And while that's awful, and I'm not saying it's very nice, have a bit of gumption. You've got a boy to look after. You know, you may as well have a life, even if your husband's gone. It just seems so unnecessary. Felt sorry for her son. I also felt really sorry for Colonel Monckton, who Satterthwaite invited to dinner with the artist, who was rather rude, direct, thought only of himself. And I thought, why would you invite somebody like Colonel Monckton when you already got that? Or whether he was already invited and he didn't think about it, I don't know. But I did feel sorry for him. You could tell he was very thrown and confused by the whole thing. But oh, what a surprise. He knew the Charnleys and he could give them some clues. So again, you know, too many coincidences. I get where she was going with it. Didn't work for me. Did it work for you, Alan?
No, I'm with you on the mechanics of the story. I didn't get my head around the Charnley House thing, as you said, because it had mentioned multiple times. Felt like it was being hammered at you, actually, that it had been shut up since the supposed suicide of the master, Lord Charnley, several years earlier. But it seemed to me, or maybe I read it wrong, that several key points revolved around the fact that people having visited the house recently. So I wasn't sure how that worked. And then early on, it was mentioned the house was full of priest holes, and that's a big red flag. I mean, and I think, you know, if you're going to mention that a house has priest holes in it, one, it gives a good age of the house, but two, you know they're going to get used at some point. So for me, that was a big red flag of how the locked room suicide could have been a murder. So there was no surprises there as to how that worked. And like you said, the coincidences were a bit far-fetched, with the painter's mysterious lady that he met on a train many years ago turning out to be, surprise, surprise, Lady Charnley. And yes, I agree with you. She needed to get on with her life. For me, the most interesting part of this one was the way that Satterthwaite kept dragging an empty chair around his house during his dinner party and looking at it and then saying things in response to what appeared to be some imagined conversation, which made me think, was he seeing Mr. Quin already in that chair before Mr. Quin appeared to everybody else? Because he left the room and the chair was empty, and then when he came back, Mr. Quin was there talking to his guest, but he'd already been having this seemingly one-side conversation. And why was he dragging this sort of empty chair around as they moved from room to room? That was intriguing for me. And why did nobody mention the fact he was dragging an empty chair around from room to room during the dinner party? That part I found intriguing. And like you, I felt really sorry for Colonel Monckton, who seemed really out of his depth at the dinner party. And I also wondered why Satterthwaite invited him to dinner. Or did he already know that Monckton had been a witness to the suicide that they were going to talk about that night? Or that the picture he'd purchased of the dead Harlequin was connected to the suicide? Too many coincidences, and surprisingly for an Agatha Christie story of what I've read so far in the 1 year we've been doing this, huge leaps of logic in this one that you don't normally find in a Christie story. So the mechanics of it, the coincidences, the leaps of logic, it didn't really work for me this time around, despite the mystery of the empty chair, which I think would have been a much better title.
Oh, yeah, that would have been really good, wouldn't it? The mystery of the empty chair. Yeah, I thought about that too. It was a bit odd the way he did. And like you said, you kept looking at it, but was he talking to him? Was Mr. Quin there? I do like the mystery around Mr. Quin. I don't ever want it to be explained, but I just feel these second half of the stories, he's just not in them enough.
No, he isn't. Before we move on to discussing the last three stories, we want to take a quick break to tell you about our Patreon account, where you can now get early access to our podcasts as well as our Patreon exclusive Agatha adjacent podcast series. The Patreon account is a great place to find out our exclusive Agatha adjacent episodes, such as Agatha Slept Here, about our visits to Greenway, Abney Hall, and the Old Swan Hotel. The Grand Tour, a review of both the book on Agatha's early travels and the related David Suchet TV series. Agatha and the Doctor, a look at Agatha's encounter with the 10th Doctor from the Doctor Who TV series, and more. Patreon members also get early access to the regular Chronological Christie episodes ahead of their general release dates, as well as the opportunity to submit questions for our bonus Q&A episodes. It's quick and easy to join our growing Patreon community, starting at the Greenway level for just $5 a month. Think about all our extra Agatha goodness for the price of a cup of coffee or tea, whichever is your beverage of choice. You can find all the details at patreon.com/Chronological Christie. And thanks for your support. And with that, let's move on to our next story, The Bird with the Broken Wing. While staying with the Keeleys at their country house, Mr. Satterthwaite happens to be in the library while the young guests are holding a séance. Among the nonsensical messages is one clear one: Quin and Laydell. Before long, there is a tragic death in the Laydell house, and Satterthwaite, with the help of the message from Mr. Quin, correctly determines, surprise, surprise, it wasn't suicide, but murder. This story has never been adapted. What did you think of this one, Jill?
I really wish we hadn't learnt that Mr. Satterthwaite was only in his 60s, as the text makes him sound so much older and doesn't really fit in with my thoughts of a 60-year-old. Were they really that much more frail back then? This is much more of a straight mystery than working out what happened in the past. So he has a much more active role in this. And I think he does very well, although he will never forgive himself for not stopping the murder of poor Maybelle from the doomed family where everyone dies young. How does that work? Some at least need to be old enough to have children and bring them up a bit, surely. So what does young actually mean? If being in your 60s is old, to me, young would mean to me before you turn 2025. That's something to think over. I am very much over suicide actually being murder. We have had quite a few of these in these stories, and reading them one after the other definitely makes it very tedious at times. Maybe looking at it as a lack of creativity. Maybe as these were written when they were supposed to be published as short stories in magazines rather than in a collection. Maybe just reading one now and then wouldn't feel so bad, but reading the 12 stories one after the other in a book, that has become the overarching theme, and it feels like a lack of creativity to me. And that's something I don't think you can ever accuse Agatha Christie of having a lack of creativity. Back off that hobby horse. I felt the reason for the murder was rather stark and made me stop and read it again in case I had misunderstood. But no, he murdered her because he could, and no one ever noticed him. genius on Christie's behalf, but absolutely terrifying. And the general thing that there might be people out there that do things just because they could is just terrifying. And I did start to wonder how well Madge's marriage to Roger Graham will work out, as he will always probably be half in love with the image of the young, beautiful Maybelle who will never age, and definitely could have done with more Mr. Quin. What did you think, Alan?
Yeah, not enough Mr. Quin. And another one with a seance type beginning, starting to, as you said, there's some definite repetitive themes running through these short stories. And does the fact that Mr. Quin already communicated his presence and where Satterthwaite needed to go indicate that he's more of a spiritual guide than a corporeal one because he did it through a seance? Another piece of the mystery. And as you said, another, it wasn't a suicide story. And it feels like there's been an overabundance of those in this collection. However, I did like the fact that Satterthwaite was so convinced that the death of the ethereal Mabel Annesley was a murder that he couldn't stop himself from blurting it out when the police inspector was questioning everybody. I thought that was fun. There's an aside here that Satterthwaite and Inspector Winkfield, awesome name, by the way, Winkfield, I like that, had worked together on a previous case that isn't part of this collection, which is pretty well a self-contained continuity up to this point. So I wondered if that was a short story idea that Christie had meant to write but never did, or maybe it was an unfinished idea, because we don't get much of these sort of undocumented cases in Christie, like you do in some other series, where mentions get made of things that the lead characters have done that aren't covered in any of the books. Holmes, in particular, there's quite a few of those, and to a lesser extent, some of the James Bond Fleming novels, too, that mention is made of other cases that they've been on previously. So I would have liked to maybe know more about what it was that when Satterthwaite and Winkfield worked together before. The resolution with figuring out that she'd been strangled with a string from a ukulele and then killer restringing it with a wrong-sized string, I thought was a neat one. And as you said, the killer's motive of, I just did it for the attention, very chilling. No unrequited love, failed romance, or stolen inheritance, or even revenge. Just, I did it so people would notice me. Very, very chilling, very dark.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think this one broke the mold a bit by having Satterthwaite be a witness to the event at the time. No looking back at clues from the distance on this one. It was more of a straight whodunit and no real need for Mr. Quin. Satterthwaite's despair at not being able to save Maybelle's life was almost palpable at the end. That was very well written and a great insight into his character. That he had basically failed for once.
I agree. I think with each of these stories, even if I don't particularly like the main premise of the story, parts of each story stick with you and make you think. And I find that interesting. His despair was very well written.
Yeah, even the ones I haven't particularly liked or felt have been a bit thin or don't work, they've all got some nugget of really excellent, incisive writing in them.
Yeah, definitely. Right, we'll move on to the penultimate one, The Man from the Sea. A man tries to leap to his death, unable to bear his own unhappiness. But Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quin are on hand to try and restore some joy to his life. A story written with conviction, it is a confident early work from Agatha Christie, focusing on the nature of happiness. The story was then abridged and broadcast in 2011 as part of BBC Radio 4's series of afternoon readings performed by Martin Jarvis. Now, I actually remembered reading this one years ago, and obviously I've read them all anyway, but this one must have stuck in my memory longer, and I'm not quite sure if that's because it was melodramatic. Maybe I liked the love story part of it at some point, or what, but I find it interesting that so far out of all of them, this was the one where I thought, I remember this one. It is a rather melodramatic story, but I did enjoy Mr. Satterthwaite wondering what his life was worth without a wife and a family, then contemplating how it could have been awful if they had all hated each other. Thought that was a great way to count your own blessings. Another one where he's not really quite sure where he went. I'm assuming it's some Spanish island somewhere because that got referred to at one point, but it never actually tells you where he is, which I found irritating. But I thought the best piece of writing in this one was of the dog. When Satterthwaite was going for a walk, he watches this dog enjoying his day, having a stretch, having a roll in something that smelt disgusting. And then it's all ended by the dog being killed by a car. But it was just a superb piece of writing. The descriptions of how the dog was just enjoying what he was doing and he was in the moment. I could almost see the dog going about his usual activities. I thought that was very interesting, and I'm going to blame me really finding that the best part on our daughter Megan, who is a dog trainer, and we meet lots of dogs because of that. But the actual story about the dying man and the woman in the villa as a romance wasn't half as interesting. It was rather contrived, and I didn't really care about what happened to Ho. Again, not enough Mr. Quin and Mr. Satterthwaite in conversation. That's my favourite bit out of all these. Even if parts of the writing were very good, the descriptions of his walk up the hill on that was also very good, but it didn't strike me quite half as much as the description of the dog. What did you think, Alan?
Yeah, Megan's got a lot to answer for with our enjoyment and love of dogs now.
She does.
And I agree, that scene was very well written, with him enjoying life before meeting his unfortunate end. The one thing she didn't talk about, because she just said when he realised the dog was dead, he walked on. I'm like, I hope he picked him up from the middle of the road and put him at the side of the road or did something. But it seemed a bit callous after all that. He just went, oh, the dog's dead, and he carried on. And I'm like, she didn't say it, but I hope he actually did something like move the poor thing out of the middle of the road.
I would agree, particularly knowing Agatha Christie's love of dogs.
You mentioned it, she doesn't specify the island they're on, which is very unusual in the collection because she's been very specific about places. Her saying it was, clearly it was a Spanish-speaking and close to the Riviera, so I'm guessing it's one of the Balearic Islands like Mallorca or Ibiza or one of those, but which have all become very popular since. But it's very strange that she didn't nail it down. She, from the description, had somewhere in mind with the way she talks about the houses and the bougainvillea and the cliff walks, and it read like somewhere she'd been, a bit like the Corsica story. So I don't know why she didn't pick an island.
Okay, so in our script from the Big Four, we have that Agatha went with Rosalind and her secretary Carlo to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands to convalesce. So I'm wondering if it was somewhere like that.
Mr. Satterthwaite's age being established as 69 in this story means 7 years have elapsed during this collection, because in the very beginning, first story, it talks about him being 62. So that's interesting that we don't often see a specific timeline and in these collections from what I've seen of Christie so far in general. So I thought that was interesting. Plus the fact, as you said, there's a note in there that other people often see him as being older, even as old as 80. He must have really lived a good life to be looking so aged and bent and stuff at the age of 69, I guess. No crime this time around, really. This is really just a forlorn love story whose happy ending was pretty obvious once you did the math about how old the son of the woman in the villa was. By the way, did she ever get a name? I don't think she did she?
No.
When compared with the suicidal return island visitor, Anthony Cosden. Again, suicide, or somebody trying to do suicide. Makes me wonder a bit about Christie's state of mind in between 25 and 1930. She was writing these. Suicide seems to come up a lot. Having said that, I did approve of the message that life is always worth living because you never know what tomorrow will bring. I thought that was great. Again, not enough Mr. Quin in this one, though having him appear to Cosden in the full Harley Quinn costume was a new development. I thought that was interesting, as was Quin's own revelation at the end of the story that he is, quote, a messenger for the desires of the dead, which I thought was interesting. I'm going to have to think back over the previous stories to see if that explanation holds up on the other ones. But apart from being reported as seen by Cosden and a brief exchange with Satterthwaite, once again, he's hardly in a story in his own book, which I'm finding more and more strange. Which brings us to the last story, Harlequin's Lane. When two Russian dancers are injured in a car crash on the way to a performance at a masquerade, substitutes are quickly found so the show can continue. But there is mysterious work at play that could put anyone in real danger. While visiting the rather dull and conventional Denmans, Mr. Satterthwaite unexpectedly meets Mr. Quin on a road called Harlequin's Lane. This story was abridged as part of the BBC Radio 4 series of afternoon readings in 2011 and was performed by Martin Jarvis. And we really need to see if we can dig out find recordings of those, because I would love to hear them. Jill, what did you think of this final story in the collection?
This is another visit where Mr. Satterthwaite wonders why he revisits a dull couple. He was wondering why he hasn't gone to the Riviera in the last one. Another reason to assume Christie never saw these being included altogether when she wrote them. There was a lot in here I wasn't really interested in, and it felt just like filling. Did we really need a whole rundown of the play or whatever you would call it? Having never seen a Harlequin ad or any of that stuff, none of it made sense. None of it meant anything to me. I just couldn't follow it. All we needed was a few lines describing Mrs. Denman's dancing for Satterthwaite and Prince Orloff to recognize her as the prima ballerina Anna Karshanova, who disappeared from Russia during the revolution. It's all you needed. It was just enough of that so they could recognize her. The love story of John Denman and Molly Stanwell, and then Mrs. Denman and Prince Orloff, were too much for a short story with everything else going on. Unless John killed his wife at the end wearing the Harlequin costume he thought he couldn't fit in, then I have no clue why Mr. Quin was there at all, as he is usually a facilitator in solving crimes or stopping murder. So this ending is quite mystifying and rather annoying for me. Had a thought as I was falling asleep after I'd written up my notes. Mrs. Denman had made a comment about how her husband had looked at her after she had danced, and Mr. Satterthwaite had said that he was more in love with her than ever. And she had commented, but for how long? Because if he was in love with Molly, whatever her name was, Molly Stanwell. So maybe it was her song. Maybe she went out on a high and that was what she wanted to do, because she was in love with her husband and Prince Orloff was in love with her, but she felt like she was going to lose her husband. Maybe she wanted to go out while he still was thinking, oh my God, she was amazing. But again, Mr. Quin, like we said, he's meant to solve these things and solve whether things are suicide or murder or stop something happening. And here he facilitated her suicide. Or was it murder because her husband killed her? I don't really know. This one has niggled my brain for longer than the others. She really is a genius in making me think, but I also feel frustrated because we're never going to know what the real answer was. And maybe that's the whole point of the ending of it. Nobody ever really knows what happened. Calling that a rubbish heap at the end of Harlequin's Lane was a weird description, as it was rubbish in a massive hole from mining. To me, a heap is above ground, not in a hole. So that's just another criticism from me. But obviously, it's got me thinking, so it's not all bad. What about you, Alan?
This one baffled me, and not in a good way, because I couldn't work out the mystery because I didn't feel there really was one. It also baffled me in that I was left confused by the story itself and what its point was. The central conceit that the Russian-born Mrs. Denman was in reality the much-admired ballerina Anna Karshanova, hopefully that's right, was pretty obvious from the moment she said that she knew about dance. And her line, quote, "For 10 years I've lived with the man I love, now I'm going to the man who for 10 years has loved me," just didn't ring true and seemed inordinately cruel and cynical. True, she'd found out her husband was having an affair, but if she loved him, wouldn't she confront him first, rather than abandon him for somebody who doesn't love her, but just adores her as a dancer? But I also got thinking about what you just said, and maybe she was hoping that dancing at that party, operetta, whatever it was, would rekindle her husband's love for her by seeing her dance again. Maybe, I don't know. But it was all very unclear. It all seemed very muddled. What was the thing about the rare and delicate Chinese screen in her living room that contrasted with the staid English furniture? Satterthwaite said that's why he kept going back to visit it, because he was intrigued by this screen. And they talked about how, they'd had to buy it, as her and her husband had to buy it as a young couple. And it put them in almost, in financial straits for a year, but they just had to put the money down and buy it. And then there was no payoff. What was the point of it? It was never resolved. And like you, the detailed description of the play, dance, whatever, I thought was tedious and largely meaningless unless you know that particular ballet, operetta, whatever in detail, which clearly Christie did. And yeah, I didn't get the ending at all. Why did Anna Karshanova apparently end up dead in the rubbish-filled hole at the bottom of Harlequin's Lane? And what was Mr. Quin's role there? Did he entice her to her end to commit suicide? Or if her husband did indeed kill her because, she was going to go off with somebody else, why didn't Mr. Quin or Mr. Satterthwaite stop it? And, isn't Quin's role to help lovers and prevent tragedy, to speak for the dead? Yet it seems to me that he knew what her destiny was all along and he did nothing to stop it. In fact, it almost read like he was also trying to lure Mr. Satterthwaite to his end too at one point. So it was all very confusing and a weird way to end this collection that seemed at odds with everything that went before. I think they'd have been better not including this one and stopping the collection with the previous story.
Yeah, it's one of her favourites.
I know. I was confused. So that's all the stories we've talked about, but we thought before we signed off, we'd actually just have a quick discussion about general thoughts on the book and this collection overall. And if I was confused by the end, I think I was a little confused by the whole thing. I started really enjoying these stories and the mystery of who Mr. Quin was and his connection to Mr. Satterthwaite. I thought the early descriptions of Mr. Quin and the way he would appear actually reminded me of one of my favorite DC Comics characters, the Phantom Stranger, particularly when she actually would talk about how his hat or the shadow would fall across his face like a mask, and he would turn up and help direct the conversation in the way that Mr. Satterthwaite and others would figure things out. But then, I don't know, if she seemed like Christie either got tired of the concept or couldn't figure out how to use him, as he started to appear less and less in these stories, which is odd for a character whose name is the book title. To be honest, this collection felt like the Mr. Satterthwaite mysteries more than the mysterious Mr. Quin, because it was clearly about Satterthwaite, and he's the guy we got to know more about. But to your point earlier, maybe we weren't meant to figure out Mr. Quin and who he was. Was he a messenger for the dead, or was he part of Satterthwaite's conscience or imaginary character or some spiritual being? Maybe we just weren't meant to figure it out, but there just didn't seem to be a lot of consistency there, which I think made it intriguing but also a little frustrating. As we said earlier, I think many of the stories were very well written, particularly they all had some really strong parts to them, but I did find the themes becoming repetitive and the mysteries in general easier to solve. Maybe that's because I'm reading more Christie, and each of these stories sort of added to that. Like you said, Jill, I think it's pretty clear that these stories were meant to be read standalone with only a very loose continuity as short stories in magazines, because for me, they didn't work read back to back. In fact, at times it actually became a bit of a chore and a slog to keep going just to finish for the podcast. It was like, oh, do I really have to read another one of these tonight? Which is a shame, because I think it started out with so much promise and ended up in, for me personally, disappointment and confusion. I don't think I'd go back to it. Probably of the 3 short story collections we've read so far, this is my least favorite. What about you? How did you feel about it?
Well, first of all, I have to talk about that damn name, Satterthwaite. I know when she wrote the books, she wasn't expecting somebody to sit there, read all 12, and then talk about them. But having to type out Mr. Satterthwaite and say it as many times as we had in these, my brain was like, oh, why couldn't she call him John Smith? Or, something easy to say. That would have been nice. Unless we're actually pronouncing Mr. Satterthwaite wrong and it's like Fanshawe. Maybe she did. I don't know. I don't know, but it is hard to say.
I would have preferred Inspector Winkfield.
Yes. But back to the books, the overall melancholy feel of the book was quite interesting to start with. But after about halfway through, I found it rather grating. And there seemed a sameness about them all that made it easier to work out what would happen. The only one I felt I didn't guess was the murder in The Bird with the Broken Wing. That was quite shocking because I wasn't really sure what was going to happen in that one. Some people say that this was her best writing and she was writing something she loved and only wrote one when she felt like it. They are all well written for sure, but is it her best writing? Personally, not for me, I would say. Although, as I mentioned in the story, the few paragraphs about the dog and the man from the sea was truly superb writing. But I feel like we've read some really good stuff so far, and we've got even better stuff to come. I wouldn't say this was her best writing for me personally. It's good, but those overreaching thoughts, the melancholy, the suicide, is it suicide or is it murder, and that is interesting. They were published later, but did she write some of these when she was struggling things and they helped her clear her mind? Maybe? Who knows? Maybe we're thinking about it too much.
Isn't that the point of the podcast?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Chronological Christie podcast. If you would like to leave a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform, that would be great. And thanks to those folks who have already done that. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. If you'd like to discuss any aspect of this episode, you can message us on the Chronological Christie Instagram account, a link for which will be in the show notes, or you can find us on social media. Jill, where can you be found?
I can be found on the Chronological Christie Instagram, TikTok, and Threads accounts, and my author TikTok under Gilly Kent.
And I can be found on most social platforms by searching for @AlanJPorter or via my author's website at alanjporter.com. And if you want to keep up with our various writing projects, you can sign up for our free bi-weekly newsletter at alanjporter.substack.com, and I really should get it written.
Good plan. The books discussed on this podcast can be found on a dedicated Chronological Christie section of our online bookstore at bookshop.org. The link will also be in the show notes. And talking of bookshop.org, it's also the place where you can buy our latest books online while still supporting your local independent bookstore. Check out my new novel, Trust Issues, a light romantic thriller that's getting great reviews, and Alan's new collection of Victoria-era adventure short stories, Saloons, Jungles and City Streets, featuring Wild Bill Hickok, Alan Quatermain and Sherlock Holmes. Please join us for our next episode where we will be discussing the Sittaford Mystery. We look forward to you joining us.
The music used in this episode was extracted from I'm Somebody Somebody Now by the Joe Venuti Orchestra and is a public domain recording. The Chronological Christie podcast is a production of Megrin Entertainment, a division of 4J's Group, LLC.